Welcome back, Wolfpack. Verlis here, and I feel this video has been kind of overdue, so it's time to talk about Minimize and Evasion and inform people about how it is mechanically and statistically balanced. This isn't really an opinion, this is fact when you break down the mechanics of the game and how these moves interact with other Pokemon and just the way that people feel about them. So if you are never going to be convinced that Minimize or Evasion is balanced in any way, then why'd you even click on this video? You literally clicked on this video just to get pissed off, even though I have facts that prove that kind of mindset wrong. So let me start off with my favorite statistic, my favorite number, my favorite data point of all time. There it is. Isn't it beautiful, guys? What this is the amount of people that voted in favor of banning Evasion for Smogon. Now, you might be thinking, well, it's 66%, it still got banned. Doesn't that mean I'm right for thinking Evasion is bad? But when you look at it, 66.4%, if one more person voted to not support the ban on Evasion, Evasion would be legal. And also, when you think about 66%, it feels like way more people hate Minimize, way more people think Evasion is unfair than just 66.4% of people. It's close to like 80-90%, so it just kind of shows that this mentality has left the realism of the actual balance inside of Evasion, and this was in 5th generation. Now that we're in the 6th generation, there's actually many more counters to Evasion and a lot more changes about it that actually make it to where Evasion is actually weaker now than it got its 66.4% ban support back in the 5th generation. So this just shows that's like a mob mentality that, oh, Evasion's banned, so it must be bad, therefore it's not balanced in any way, therefore it's uncompetitive, and then all these other stupid arguments start forming from that. But here's where the rest of the video comes in. I'm about to debunk everything about Evasion using just the facts that we have in the game, and it all comes down to like one person voting to not ban Evasion. Like, that's kind of crazy how I almost doomed this and created such a crazy snowball mentality about it over such a small number. So first off, let's look at the stat charts. Now, for those of you who aren't aware, Evasion accuracy modifiers are actually different than regular modifiers. They go on a reduced scale, so 1 point in Evasion or accuracy is actually going to be less than 1 point in gaining attack, speed, defense, or losing attack, speed, or defense. That goes by 75%, 60%, 50, 43, 36, 33, whereas for the regular stat chart, it's going to be 66, 50, and then it goes down from there. So you get much smaller returns, that the returns are greater for anything outside of Evasion. Now here's where it starts getting interesting. In the 1st generation, it was all the same. But in the 2nd generation, Evasion got its first nerf right there. That it seemed like, it gained a little too much momentum a little too quickly, so its cap was reduced and its scaling was also reduced. Now in the 3rd generation, it further received a nerf because it means that Evasion and accuracy stack together. So say, for example, you have +2 Evasion and -2 accuracy. In Generation 2, it was actually your opponent had a 36% chance of hitting you, that they stacked in that regard, but after Generation 2, they actually just kind of treat it as either -4 accuracy or +4 evasion, so it's only 43%, which means you can't like scale it out of control. You can't have a +6 evasion Pokemon going up against a -6 accuracy for like a 10% chance of hitting a move. No, it's actually balanced a little more beyond that to where no matter what, it's only going to be 33% accurate at its absolute lowest. Now in the 4th generation, I don't think there were any nerfs, and in the 5th and 6th generation, there were actually a lot of nerfs based on buffing other moves. So let's talk about the moves that just bypass accuracy in general. So right here are the first most basic counters to Evasion. Aerial Ace, Aura Sphere, Magical Leaf, Magnet Bomb, all these moves, they have a relatively low base power, anywhere between 60 and 80 base power, and unless you're using Stab, they're not really going to hit too hard. But here's the thing. These are the moves that just straight up bypass Evasion. That if your opponent's using Minimize, if your opponent's lowering your accuracy, these moves will always land. And that's something just to keep in mind, that if your opponent's using turns of setup and you're getting free damage on them, or you're boosting as well and then going into damage, it actually makes these moves rather effective, but at the same time, a lot of people just disregard them entirely. However, there are still many other things that apply against Evasion that have been in recent generations. So let's just look at other things you can use. Taunt. Taunt is going to shut down Evasion before your opponent can start rolling. Now, it does have a base accuracy of 90%, so you will have to outspeed your opponent before they get to using Minimize, but if you do that, they're pretty much shut down. So that's a forced switch, that's free setup for you, that's free advantage, and they lose almost all of their momentum. As long as that taunt Pokemon is alive, that Pokemon is completely shut down pretty much. Then we also have Haze, Roar, Whirlwind, Clear Smog. Now these moves are also really interesting because they will effectively remove any stat gains, and they also bypass accuracy. I believe in 6th generation it was added to where Roar and Whirlwind, they don't care about evasion boosting, so you can Roar and Whirlwind even a +6 evasion Pokemon with perfect accuracy. Same with Haze, it doesn't count as a direct attack, so it's going to clear all the stat changes, which means all of your opponent's turns of boosting were effectively wasted, and then Clear Smog. Clear Smog actually doesn't check accuracy, all it has to do is land on the Pokemon. Now there are no Steel-type Pokemon that learn Minimize, so you can hit any Minimize Pokemon with Clear Smog and clear their stats. Also, we have a couple of other things. Sacred Sword. Sacred Sword bypasses Evasion, Keen Eye. A Pokemon with the ability Keen Eye doesn't care about Evasion, and Toxic. Now, when Toxic is used by a Poison-typing Pokemon, it has perfect accuracy as well. Then we also have Thunder and Rain and a couple of other things like that. But I think these are the big ones to note right here because they're not bad moves. They're not moves that are just miserable and you can't use them. Completely good moves that actually work really well outside of evasion boosting. If your opponent's going for Swords Dance, if your opponent is trying to go for Calm Minds, these moves work beautifully anyways, especially Sacred Sword. Sacred Sword also ignores defensive boosting, so if your opponent's going for Stockpile, Iron Defense, anything like that, Sacred Sword cuts through that, cuts through evasion, and completely counters out that Pokemon, so these are very viable moves. And then there are the moves you might not know about. So Stomp, Steamroller, Body Slam, Dragon Rush, Flying Press, and Phantom Force. If the opponent has specifically used Minimize, the moves actually gain perfect accuracy and will inflict double damage. So this is also an ultimate counter to Minimize boosting Pokemon. A move like Dragon Rush. Now it does have lower accuracy, but it does have higher base power, and if you go up against a Minimize Pokemon, it was absolutely worth it. Body Slam is an entirely viable move, and I feel that this is actually a reason to run it more. So Body Slam makes it to where you have a 30% chance of inflicting paralysis, and it's a decent base power. We have Flying Press, now it is an exclusive move, and Phantom Force. Not a lot of Pokemon get Phantom Force, but still worth carrying because now you just hit through evasion and you do tons of damage while also being semi-invulnerable. Okay, I know that was a lot to talk about, but let's just jump to the point really quick. So the point is, Game Freak hasn't just left Minimize and Evasion as this like untapped free ground of like instant winning or anything. That it's actually the complete opposite. That's been nerfed in almost every generation, with the most substantial being in the 6th generation, yet seems completely ignored because of all this ignorance and hate towards evasion. That we can look right here. These are all the Pokemon that get minimized. That's it. We just have Clefable, Muck, Chansey, Blissey, Quillfish, Drifblim, Chandelure, and Starmie. And that's it. Those are the big Pokemon that you have to worry about. Now, a lot of these Pokemon have something in common. They're very slow. So Lampent has a better base speed, and Starmie might outspeed some Pokemon. Now, I just proved that Evasion and Minimize is like mechanically balanced, that you can't say that Game Freak hasn't tried to make it balanced, and that there's no counters to it, because there's actually many ways of stopping Evasion right now that people are just completely ignoring. So now we're going to get onto the statistical part of it, where I feel that Evasion is also very statistically balanced because of the changes made in the 2nd generation. So when we keep an eye on these Pokemon, just remember, they're going to be slower, so the opponent's going to be able to strike or react first in many situations. So now let's get on to the math side of things. So Minimize. Let's just talk about Minimize right now. The first time you use it, your opponent has a 60% chance to hit you. Well, if we're talking about completely neutral grounds, Minimize is a completely inefficient move on that first turn. That's only 60%. So I use my turn to not take any action against my opponent, and my opponent still has a 60% chance of landing. Also, if the opponent is faster than me, say I'm using a Pokemon like Muck, Clefable, Chansey, I'm going to be slower than my opponent in almost every situation. So my opponent hits me for free, I use Evasion, and now they still have greater odds of landing a move on me. Even after I use Minimize a second time. That puts me at +4, so 43% of their accuracy. Now that's completely inefficient. By using another turn, where again, I'm not taking any actions against my opponent, I'm leaving myself completely vulnerable, I only take away 17% chance from their chance to hit. That's not that great. And then over time, you know, we use Evasion for that third turn, we use Minimize for that third, so we only reduce their chance to hit by a further 10%, and then it caps out. We can't use it anymore, and it becomes a lowest chance 1 in 3. So that means it takes 3 turns to get to a 1 in 3, and for 2 of those turns, they had beneficial odds of beating me, and I'm still not taking any action towards them. Now, I think 1/3 is actually a really great number to talk about, because when we look at a move like Scald, Scald is prioritized over Surf in almost every situation because it only has a 30% chance to burn your opponent. Now, burn is very crucial in a lot of situations, because if you burn a tanky Pokemon, that way it loses a lot of its setup potential. That's taking extra % damage, and that's a really bad thing to deal with. Against a physical Pokemon, if that physical Pokemon is burned, it is going to have a very hard time because it loses half of its attack. However, that's 30% to start with. They only have a 1 in 3 chance of getting that burn, so people will gamble on that. People will need the burn in a lot of situations to win. So they'll use Scald over and over, even if it's not going to deal the most damage. They'll use Scald as a way of forcing a status, even though it's lower odds than even Minimize at 3 turns. So I have to set up for 3 turns to have slightly better odds of my opponent missing than my opponent actually getting a burn on me just from using Scald in general. I feel that this just shows another reason why there's a lot of misinformation or just a lot of animosity that shouldn't exist toward Evasion, because people play the chances all the time. People will run Thunder Wave and they'll be like, come on, I need that 25, I need the paralysis, I need it to win. People will pray for that 30% burn, for that 25% chance to hit. People use Hurricane, 30% chance of confusion, then 50% that the confusion will actually go through from the Hurricane. People use this as an effective part of the strategy, but then they'll turn around and condemn Minimize for whatever reason, even though it just has the same amount of balance right here. Now, we've only talked about Minimize to this point, so people are going to ask, well, you didn't mention Double Team. Double Team isn't even worth mentioning. That here's another thing about Evasion. So there are some other things like Roar, Haze, that's still going to work against Double Team or Minimize. That there are only those Minimize exclusive moves. So Double Team, even Evasion in general, has its own counters, but Double Team is so inefficient. So we talked about Minimize. Minimize really isn't efficient until like the 3rd turn because you have to get all that setup in there. You're so vulnerable. You have to take so much damage. You have to put yourself at so much risk before it even has a chance of working out. And then there's Double Team. Double Team almost never becomes efficient because it takes 6 turns to get to 1/3. That by the time you get to 3 turns, that's only half odds. So it takes 3 turns just to break even statistically. I don't think that that's absurd. I don't think that that's overpowered. Same with Minimize. These statistics behind it, the chance, isn't even that beneficial to the person using Minimize. So there's one of those things, like, it's not this overly busted thing, so I don't even know why it should be banned. Double Team, Stage 1 Evasion is hardly worth it. Sure, it's frustrating, but at the same time, it doesn't really matter because it's not going to efficiently be a strategy for winning a battle. So that's kind of it right there. I just proved that it's Evasion and Minimize are mechanically sound, they're statistically sound, and that really, there's no reason to hate it because people play the chances all the time. I mean, Pokemon's just a game of luck. Like, sure, skill is involved, but there is a lot of luck. Whether or not you have to make the right prediction at the right time against the right opponent, or that just 6.25 chance of getting crit and losing off of exclusively that chance to lose off of a crit, or, you know, Scald Burn. All the little hacks in the game. Oh, that was the 10% chance for Shadow Ball to reduce special defense, and now I 2-shot you instead of 3-shot you. The game is full of RNG, and Evasion is actually some of the most balanced RNG because it's something that's built in there, that you have to intentionally make that play on Evasion, so there's actually things that intentionally remove the efficiency of those plays instead of just keeping it random. It's not like there's a move that says, oh, your opponent has half a chance of getting Scald Burn or something like this while this Pokemon's on the field. No, there's actually ways of taking away the gain from Minimize and Evasion that people are ignoring when the rest of the RNG-filled game is just running rampant. So I think there's either just like a lot of hypocrisy or just the understanding or just being a part of that mob mentality. It's just easier to hate this game mechanic than to understand it. So now let's get to the arguments, because I'm going to address some things at the end that will completely ruin any argument against Minimize or Evasion. So first off, it's not fair. Well, actually, I just kind of covered that in the last thing. Pokemon isn't fair, that there's no way of removing all of the non-autonomous actions in the game, that something stupid can happen at any given time, and whether or not you wanted it to happen, it still has a chance of happening, and even then, fairness in a competitive game, there's really no way of judging that fairness is completely arbitrary, that there isn't a gauge for fairness, and there isn't a way of saying that, okay, since that's not fair, it can't be used. Even though there is a lot of fairness in the mechanical and statistical balance to it. Just because you feel helpless that you can't attack your opponent doesn't mean you get to call your opponent a filthy Minimize user because you are ignorant to the way that Evasion works. Like, that's just not how it works. Also, this is a competitive game. Like, when we're playing it in a competitive environment, pretty much anything goes. That as long as it's in the rule set, it shouldn't really matter, which is another big point. It's in the Pokemon rules. So actually, the game developers say it's fine. They've made changes to try to make people more okay with it. So I mean, that's a huge blow to any kind of Evasion upset right there. But at the same time, it's also a competitive game. Things are going to happen that you disagree with. Your opponent brings a Pokemon that you don't want to face, that your opponent gets lucky, that your opponent just has the better team, even though you had no other factors. Sometimes skill doesn't matter in Pokemon. The more skilled player, it doesn't have a guaranteed chance of winning every Pokemon battle. So that's the thing about fairness. It's just going to happen. That's one of the things you need to accept, even though all this hatred around Minimize Evasion is one of the more balanced and predictable mechanics, which is really odd to me. So then we have the next argument. Well, if you like it so much, why don't you go fight it? If you went up against the Minimize Chansey, then you would hate Evasion too. Look, I've been playing Pokemon competitively for like 9 years now. Of course I've gone up against Minimize everything. I've seen a Minimize Quillfish. Now I did get around it, but I have lost to Minimize Chanseys before. I have won with Minimize Pokemon. I've beaten Minimize Pokemon. That's why I feel it's balanced. It's not like every single time I've gone up against an Evasion user, I immediately lose the battle. I find my way around it, I play to my best, and I see what I can do about it, and that's how you just play Pokemon in general. I have fought it, and I don't think that it's not like I haven't ever encountered Evasion, so I think that it's this magical thing that's completely balanced. No, of course I've gone up against it, and that's why my thoughts stand the way they do, because I'm using actual logic to break down if it's strong or not, and it's fine. That, you know, Pokemon is a game where you'll have unfair things happen, and you just have to roll with it. Another argument is I don't want to be forced to using X. I don't want to have to use Haze, I don't want to have to use all these other moves just in case I run into Evasion. Well, that's Pokemon. Pokemon is such a diverse game. Over 700 Pokemon, probably over 300 usable Pokemon, something around that number, and then tons of moves, tons of different abilities, tons of different items. You can't predict everything in Pokemon. No team is going to win 100% of the battles. So you just have to pick and choose. If you complain about losing to Evasion and you don't pick one of these many options, then the only fault is on you. That you ignore having a Body Slam user, that you think Dragon Rush is a terrible move, so now you get run over by a Minimize user. That's all your fault. If you don't want to have No Guard, if you don't want to have any of these things, that if you also lose to Calm Mind boosting, maybe it would just be a good idea to put Haze on your team in general, or have a Roar Pokemon. So what if that Pokemon gets knocked out? Well, then the opponent played to his win condition. The opponent said, alright, I removed his 1 or 2 evasion counters, now I set up my evasion Pokemon win. That's just the ebb and flow of the Pokemon battle, and it's not like, oh, evasion's too busted. No, there's so many tools in Pokemon to get around it. And another argument is tanky Pokemon. Now I feel the tanky Pokemon argument is kind of bad because the biggest one is, well, only tanky Pokemon get minimized, so it makes them really strong. I can't 2-hit KO them, so they're guaranteed setup before that happens. Well, some of these, actually all these Pokemon have some situation where they're going to get one-shot. That these Pokemon aren't invulnerable to damage or they don't take reduced damage. You just need to have, again, the right Pokemon at the right time in this game of infinite potential. Also, it being a tanky Pokemon makes it easier because they have to take that time to set up, and then they don't have great options from there. That they need to boost further to get any kind of offensive prowess, or they also have to like stall you out with Toxic, which just gives you a lot of turns to redemption on them. So you get that free hit in. You know, some of them do have sustain, which can be frustrating, but if you play around it right, or if you bring the counters, it doesn't matter if it's a tanky Pokemon or not because you're going to be able to get past it. And now my favorite and final argument is that Evasion takes absolutely no skill to use. This is probably the most false argument possible. Of course it takes skill to not switch in your Pokemon on something that's going to one-shot it. That you have to understand basic game mechanics, and depending on how much of it is your win condition, you have to be very smart about it. That you just can't hit the minimize button until you max out and then you automatically win the battle. It's not like you just hit minimize until you win. No, it's far from that. You have a lot of crucial choices that could win or lose you the battle to be made. If it was no skill, then everything you did wouldn't be able to be punished and you'd automatically gain advantage from that. So since Minimize is a balanced move, and since it doesn't have a lot of advantage to it initially, you have to play smart about it. You have to know when to boost, you have to know when to recover, you have to know when you just can't win the fight. You have to use the rest of your team, you know? If you know that they have a taunt Pokemon, or they have something that's going to cut through your evasion, you have to play around that Pokemon before you can bring in your evasion, before you can do anything else like that. That there's just so much else around evasion than bringing it in and winning, and that would be a true no-skill move, but it isn't. That you still have to play right. You still have to play proper Pokemon to make sure you get the most out of that evasion and not screw up. Sure, your opponent can miss 3 times in a row and that causes you to win the battle, but at the same time, your opponent still has a chance of hitting. They still have good odds of overwhelming the strategy, so you still have to play on your game, like with Drifblim. Drifblim, it wants to set up minimize, stockpile, and then potentially baton pass into another Pokemon. You have to know when to stockpile for defensive gain, you have to know when to minimize and take that risk, you know? It's all about the risk, and you have to know when to use baton pass. If you get too greedy, you use too many stockpiles, you use too much minimize, you don't weigh the odds. If you don't have proper risk assessment, your minimized Pokemon goes down for free, and it didn't matter. So yeah, of course it takes skill to use this. That's just a very poor argument that has zero validity. That's not an opinion that it takes no skill. It factually takes skill to run any strategy in Pokemon, and that's what this is. It's a strategy that you have to understand. It's not completely mindless. So that's it to Minimize. Pretty much all the arguments almost completely debunked. Like, you can't really form an opinion against Evasion with this much factual evidence going against you. So I'm going to enjoy seeing what people have to say about it. So that's it. Evasion. It's pretty balanced.